Throughout human history, plenty of dictators have left behind a legacy marked by brutality and the slaughter of millions. These figures are often beyond comprehension and can often obscure the individual suffering inflicted. But in today's video, we will look at the death tolls of history's most notorious dictators in an attempt to understand the scale of the misery inflicted on so many. We will start with perhaps the most infamous dictator, Adolf Hitler, the Führer of Nazi Germany. How many people did he kill? Seizing power in 1933, Hitler soon dismantled the democratic state and set about stripping personal liberties. A network of concentration camps housed political dissidents, whilst an oppressive surveillance state kept the people of Germany suspicious of one another. But Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond the borders of Germany. His annexations of Austria and Czechoslovakia weakened international stability. Whilst his invasion of Poland in 1939 marked the beginning of the Second World War, his regime's anti-Semitism, expansionist goals and militarism were key driving factors in starting World War II, a conflict that claimed the lives of an estimated 70 to 85 million people, a number which the human brain can't even comprehend. But the true horror of Hitler's regime lies not only in the global conflict he was responsible for, but in its implementation of a systematic campaign of genocide. The Holocaust stands as one of the most horrifying genocides in human history, in which 6 million Jews were murdered on an industrial scale, from the mass shootings in Eastern Europe and Russia, to the forced labour of thousands to death, to then the ultimate creation of the death camps and gas chambers. Hitler's regime is responsible for one of history's most infamous crimes against humanity. But Jews weren't the only victims of Hitler's regime. Roma and Sinti people, disabled people, Slavic people, homosexuals, and many more were executed on a mass scale. Around 6 million Jewish people were killed, an estimated 1.8 million non-Jewish people too, almost 3.5 million Soviet prisoners of war, and 250,000 Roma and Sinti people. In all, it is estimated that around 17 million people were murdered by Hitler's policies and his actions. Next, we turn to Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, who ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist from 1924 until his death in 1953. Stalin's grip on power was defined by terror, paranoia, and a relentless desire to consolidate control. From the imprisonment of millions in the infamous gulags to the famines in Ukraine that claimed the lives of millions, Stalin's regime was noted for its extreme brutality. Whilst the Soviet Union played a vital role in defeating Nazism in the Second World War, it was Stalin and Hitler's joint invasion of Poland that signalled the start of the conflict. Stalin's rule is known for the many purges of those he considered his enemy. The Great Purge of the late 1930s stands as one of the darkest chapters of Stalin's reign. Fearing any potential threat to his power, Stalin orchestrated a massive campaign of political repression, which saw hundreds of thousands of people arrested, imprisoned, and executed. The purges targeted political rivals, military leaders, intellectuals, and anyone suspected of opposing Stalin's regime. Stalin would personally sign the lists of those to be detained, often adding his own handwritten notes of instructions to his enforcers. It is estimated that between 600,000 up to 1.2 million people were executed during the Great Purge. Many of those purged, if not executed, ended up in the gulags, which was perhaps even worse than death. These were a brutal system of forced labour camps, often in the cold far reaches of the Soviet Union. Conditions were horrific, with prisoners subjected to grueling work, inadequate food, and brutal treatment. Millions of people perished in these camps, and estimates suggest that between 1.5 to 2 million people died in the Gulag system. But arguably, Stalin's most disturbing crime was the forced collectivization of agriculture and the famines that were the result. The Holodomor. The Holodomor was a man-made famine that ravaged Ukraine and parts of Russia. Although we can never know the true scale of the atrocity, a joint statement from the UN in 2003 declared that anywhere between 7 and 10 million people died due to the deliberate starvation of Ukrainian farmers, agricultural workers, and their families. Some estimates are as low as 3.5 million people, which isn't exactly low, but some figures put the death toll as high as 12 million. Grain was seized to feed the growing industrial cities. Farmers were framed as traitors and left to scrounge for food, with some people even resorting to cannibalism. Stalin's rule is responsible for at least the deaths of 9 million people, though estimates range as high as 20 million. It's hard to know, as not every death was recorded. The next dictator is individually arguably responsible for the most deaths in history, Mao Zedong, the founding father of the People's Republic of China. Mao presided over one of the most brutal regimes in the 20th century. His rule lasted from 1949 until his death in 1979, and his rule saw the deaths of tens of millions of people due to his policies, chief amongst them being the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. The Great Leap Forward was launched in 1958 and was an attempt to reshape China both economically and socially. The communists under Mao Zedong sought to replicate the collectivization efforts of Stalin, transforming China from an agrarian country to an industrial powerhouse. It was to utilize China's massive population to great effect, setting up communes to organize industrial and farm work. But a number of policies led to devastating failure and millions dead. In order to industrialize, Mao Zedong wanted as much steel as possible, and he created unrealistic quotas. But these unrealistic quotas led to people melting down vital farming tools in an aim to appease the state. And then there was the unsound scientific farming practices modelled on a communist idea that plants of the same species would not compete. This led to close plantings and failed crops. In a bid to protect crops from birds, Mao launched the Smash Sparrows campaign. Millions of birds were hunted and killed, leading to uncontrolled insects devastating crops. When the Yellow River flooded in 1959, the poor planning of farmland and irrigation only compounded the problems. Through this, starvation, disease, and overworking ravaged the people of China, and it is thought that anywhere from 15 to 45 million people died. The incompetence of the Great Leap Forward can be contrasted with the zealous violence of the Cultural Revolution. In 1966, Mao had been pushed out of power, but he sought to utilize the students of China to regain control. Mao aimed to purge China of what he saw as counter-revolutionary elements and remove the old culture of China. It resulted in the persecution of intellectuals, the destruction of cultural heritage, and the widespread use of violence by the Red Guards. The Red Guards were bands of students eager to prove themselves loyal to Mao with extreme violence. In some regions of China, the Red Guards engaged in ritualistic cannibalism of the defeated. This was done to prove their loyalty. Between 1 and 2 million people were killed during this period, with millions more being imprisoned, tortured, or forced into labor camps. It is estimated that anywhere from 40 to 80 million people died as a result of Mao's policies, which is around the same amount of people who died during the Second World War. The next dictator is a truly disturbing example of arbitrary violence against a population, along with forced labor on a massive scale: Pol Pot's regime in Cambodia. Pol Pot's regime, although relatively short-lived, was responsible for one of, if not the most horrifying genocides of the 20th century. His communist government was known as the Khmer Rouge. From 1975 until 1979, the Khmer Rouge, under Pol Pot's leadership, sought to create an agrarian utopia. However, this vision led to extreme brutality, as millions of Cambodians were forced into labor camps, starved, and executed. Hundreds of thousands of people were massacred in vain attempts to locate counter-revolutionaries who were undermining the unrealistic goals of Pol Pot. At the killing fields and the infamous prisons, thousands were murdered in brutal fashion, forced to confess to crimes they never even committed. When the Khmer Rouge took power, millions of men, women and children were forcibly marched into the countryside. There, they were to begin new lives on collectivized farms or on massive infrastructure projects. Those who couldn't keep up, such as children, the elderly and the disabled, were summarily executed. Many thousands died in these marches from exhaustion, lack of food and water, or killed by their escorts for perceived transgressions against the new order. Life on these farms or working on the infrastructure projects was beyond brutal. The new regime calculated that the production of rice needed to increase threefold, to 3 tons of rice per hectare. This was a ridiculous target, and one that was never going to be achieved, especially by people who had never even worked on the land before. These people had mostly come from the cities, living off meagre rations, as little as 250 grams of rice a day. The population was slowly starved to death as they were forced to attempt to create a self-sufficient utopia state. When the quotas were inevitably not achieved, the ever-paranoid regime imprisoned hundreds of thousands of people. Many of them were government party members, suspected in some way of working to destroy the utopia being created. Without any evidence whatsoever, families were purged and captured en masse, and they were sent to prisons. The most infamous of these prisons was S21. S21 was based in a former school complex, and its mortality rate for its inmates was over 99.99%. Out of the 20,000 inmates who went in through its doors, only 7 survived. And these 7 only survived because the invading Vietnamese soldiers toppled the regime in 1979. Many of those who were killed by Pol Pot's regime were murdered at the infamous killing fields. The blindfolded and handcuffed victims would be led one by one to the pre-dug graves. Bullets were not to be wasted, and so prisoners were killed with sharpened bamboo, pickaxes, or makeshift weapons. At the Chongek killing fields, infants would be murdered by smashing their skulls against a tree. The bodies were then tossed into the pits. The twisted logic of the Khmer Rouge was that if an individual was found guilty of some crime against the state, then the person's family must also be murdered, as to avoid any retribution in the future. To date, over 19,000 mass graves have been uncovered, and many more are yet to be found. Pol Pot's regime, in its quest to eliminate perceived enemies and create a pure communist society, murdered an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people, about a quarter of Cambodia's population at the time. The death tolls of history's dictators serve as chilling reminders of the consequences of dehumanization, of incompetent governance, and the dangers of unchecked power. The 4 dictators discussed today have a combined responsibility for the deaths of around 100 million men, women and children, and it could be even higher. Whilst the figures cannot tell us a complete story of those that suffered, it is a grim reminder of the massive scale of horror a government can inflict.